Before our story begins, before the mountains, before the little stone house, before the children, there was the ether, a place beyond time, a place with no sky overhead and no earth beneath your feet, a place so vast that directions stop meaning anything at all. And there, in the endless dark, two ancient presences watched the worlds below. One was called fate, the other was called chaos. For a long while, neither spoke. Far beneath them, seasons turned, snow fell, forests grew, children were born, rivers carved their paths through stone, and then chaos stirred. Something is happening, Chaos said. Fate's voice was calm. Something has been happening for 16 years. Chaos laughed softly. Perhaps. But I only noticed it now. What changed? It became interesting. For a moment, they watched in silence. Far below, on a mountainside in northern Italy, a family sat together beneath a roof of timber and stone. A father, a mother, 3 children, a small life. In a very large world. Chaos tilted its attention toward them. A pattern, it said. You always did like patterns. I do. What has happened? Fate watched the little house. The father has received a letter. Chaos considered this. And what will the letter do? For the first time, Fate did not answer. Not because Fate did not know, but because some answers are too large to fit inside a single sentence, and every story deserves to be told in its own time. Long ago, in the summer of the year 500, there stood a small stone house high in the mountains of northern Italy. It was not a grand house. No king would have noticed it. No traveler would have crossed a kingdom to see it. Yet it was beautiful all the same. The stones had been taken from the mountainside itself. The timbers came from the forests above. And every evening, when the sun slipped behind the distant peaks, the last golden light lingered there for a moment, as though reluctant to leave. A narrow path wound down through pine trees and chestnut groves toward the village below. Near the house stood a well. Beside the well grew a garden, not a wild garden, not the sort that simply appeared wherever seeds happened to land. This garden belonged to someone who knew exactly where every plant should be. The sage grew beside the lavender, the wormwood had its place, the rosemary had its place, everything had its place, and if any plant dared disagree, it soon discovered it had chosen the wrong gardener. For a year, this was the home of Chiara, and Chiara always won arguments with plants. Inside the house lived 5 people, a family, the sort of family that believes tomorrow will arrive looking very much like today, the sort of family that does not yet know a story has already begun. The father was named Marco. He was a tall man with strong hands and a patient heart. In the village below, people brought him broken things, a wheel with a cracked spoke, a loose roof beam, a stubborn gate, a bent hinge. If something could be repaired, Marco would find a way, and if it truly could not be repaired, he was kind enough to tell people gently. He never rushed, never shouted, never struck a problem harder when thinking would do better. His children trusted him for the same reason everyone else did. Things seemed steadier when Marco was nearby, as though the world itself was less likely to come apart. The mother was named Chiara, where Marco understood wood and stone. Chiara understood living things. She knew which herbs eased fevers, which roots soothed pain, which leaves belonged in a tea and which absolutely did not. Villagers often climbed the mountain seeking her help, and more often than not, they left feeling better. Chiara had strong opinions, very strong opinions, especially when it came to gardens, remedies, and people who thought they knew more than they did. Fortunately, she was usually right, at least often enough that nobody enjoyed arguing with her for long. She loved her family fiercely, the kind of love that notices when a child is troubled before a single word is spoken, the kind of love that remembers who likes honey in their tea and who pretends not to, the kind of love that makes a house feel like home. The eldest child was named Evan. He was 16 that summer, old enough to help his father, young enough to believe. He had plenty of time before becoming a man. Most days he worked beside Marco, carrying timber, repairing fences, hauling water, doing all the ordinary things that slowly teach a person how the world works. But there was something else about Evan, something he rarely spoke about whenever evening came and the day's work was finished. He would often wander outside, alone, not into the forest, not down toward the village, up, always up, toward the meadow, above the house, and there he would look at the stars. He had done this for as long as anyone could remember. At first, his parents asked why. Eventually, they stopped asking. Some questions do not need answers. Sometimes, a child simply feels called by something they cannot explain. Evan did not know why the stars fascinated him. He only knew that whenever he looked up, the world seemed larger, and somehow, that made everything feel right. Sometimes his father joined him. The two would stand together beneath the night sky without saying a word. After a while, one of them would head back inside. Neither felt the need to explain anything. They understood each other well enough already. The youngest children were twins, Tasha and Elaine, 7 years old, born on the same winter. Night identical enough to fool strangers, different enough to fool nobody who knew them. People often assumed twins must think alike. Tasha and Elaine found this very amusing because if anyone had spent even a single afternoon with them, they would have known better. Tasha was quiet, not shy, just quiet. She listened more than she spoke. She watched more than she listened. And sometimes, when she looked at something, people had the uncomfortable feeling she had noticed far more than she ought to have. Elaine, meanwhile, wanted to understand everything. If something happened once, she remembered it. If it happened twice, she compared it. If it happened 3 times, she began searching for a pattern. She counted things, measured things, recorded things. Long before she learned numbers, she had been searching for order in the world around her. When numbers finally arrived, she greeted them like old friends. The twins loved one another dearly, but they could not have been more different. One watched mysteries, the other solved them, and neither yet understood how important those gifts would become. For now, they were simply children. A boy who loved the stars, a girl who noticed what others missed, a girl who searched for patterns in everything. 3 children in a mountain home, 3 ordinary lives, or so it seemed, because, down in the house below, resting quietly in the hands of their father, a letter had just arrived. The evening meal had come and gone. The dishes had been cleared away. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing orange coals that filled the little house with warmth. Outside, the mountains were turning purple beneath the fading sky. Inside, everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Marco sat at the table, resting after a long day's work. Chiara stood near the window, looking out over the valley. The family dog slept beside the hearth, twitching occasionally as he chased something in a dream. A pair of chickens had claimed the stone wall outside. A stubborn goat wandered the yard as though it owned the place, and perhaps it believed it did. The air carried the scent of pine trees, cooling stone and fresh herbs from the garden. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing seemed important, and perhaps that is why the moment mattered so much. Because life rarely announces the evenings that change everything. They arrive disguised as ordinary days. As the last light faded from the mountains, a figure appeared on the path leading up from the village. A traveler, a messenger, a man who looked very much like someone who had walked farther than he wished to and would have preferred to be somewhere else entirely. He climbed the winding track toward the house. When he reached the door, he knocked twice. Marco opened it. The traveler reached into his satchel and produced a folded piece of vellum. "There is payment enough attached to this message to carry it another 100 miles, he said. "Which means someone must be very determined for you to receive it." Marco accepted the letter. The messenger nodded. Then, without another word, he turned and began the long walk back down the mountain. The entire visit lasted less than a minute. Yet long after the traveler disappeared among the trees, Marco remained standing in the doorway, looking at the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, deliberate, written by someone who had taken great care with every word. The wax seal had cracked during its long journey, but enough remained to show it had once been important. Marco frowned slightly, then he carried it inside. Chiara noticed his expression immediately. After years together, she could read his face almost as easily as a written page. "What is it?" she asked. Marco held up the letter. "I don't know." That answer alone was enough to draw her closer. The two of them sat together at the table. The letter lay between them. For a moment, neither moved. Then Marco carefully unfolded it, and they began to read. The room grew very quiet. Only the soft crackle of the fire could be heard. Across the room, Evan happened to be passing through. He had come inside to fetch something. He never remembered later what it was, because the moment he saw his parents reading, he stopped. Something in their faces held him there. Not fear, not alarm. Something else. Something thoughtful. Something serious. So he remained where he was, watching, pretending not to, which, as every parent knows, is a skill children believe they possess far more convincingly than they actually do. The letter had come from a relative, a distant one, the sort of relative every family seems to have. Close enough to be remembered, far enough to feel almost legendary. This man had left Italy before Evan was born. Years before, perhaps decades, he had traveled north, then farther north, then east, then north again, at least according to the letter. The journey sounded impossible. The places sounded stranger still. He spoke of lands beyond anything Marco or Chiara had ever seen. Forests larger than kingdoms, seas colder than winter itself, mountains that seemed to touch the sky. And at the edge of those distant lands, he had built something. Or perhaps discovered something. The letter was not entirely clear. Only this much was certain. The old man was growing older, and he believed there were things he could not leave behind. Knowledge, stories, secrets. Perhaps all three. He wanted someone to inherit them. Someone from his family. Someone he trusted. And so he was inviting them to come. Not someday, not eventually. Now. When Marco finished reading, neither he nor Chiara spoke for several moments. The fire crackled softly. Outside, evening settled over the mountain. Finally, Chiara looked up. "Months," she said quietly. Marco nodded. At least. The journey would take longer than anyone in the house had ever traveled. Longer than many people traveled in an entire lifetime. The letter itself had taken 6 months to arrive. Perhaps more. The man who had written it lived at the very edge of the known world, or so it seemed. Across the room, Evan understood almost none of the details, but children often notice what adults miss, and what he noticed was this. His parents looked different. Not frightened, not worried, but as though a door had suddenly appeared where no door had existed before. A door leading somewhere neither of them had expected to go, and neither had yet decided whether to open. That night, the letter remained on the table long after darkness filled the room. The children were eventually sent to bed. The lamps were extinguished. The fire burned low. The house grew quiet, or at least it appeared to, because while everyone else slept, Evan listened. From his pallet, he could hear the faint murmur of his parents talking. Their voices rose and fell softly, too quiet to understand, too distant to follow, yet now and then a single word drifted through the darkness. Distance, winter, travel, and once, his own name. After that there was silence for a very long time. Then the conversation began again. Slow, careful. The sort of conversation shared between two people standing at the edge of a decision. Long after midnight, the fire finally settled into ash and embers. The house fell still. The mountains slept beneath the stars, and the letter remained where it rested on the table. Silent, harmless-looking, no larger than a folded piece of vellum. Yet sometimes the smallest things carry the longest journeys, and sometimes a letter travels across half the world because a story is ready to begin. The family did not know it yet. But something had already changed. Not in the house, not in the mountains, not even in the letter itself. The change had happened in possibility. A path that had never existed before now lay open. And whether they chose to follow it or not, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The days passed. Summer lingered a little longer on the mountain. The grass in the high meadows turned the color of warm honey. The chestnut trees began whispering about autumn, and life carried on much as it always had. The letter was never mentioned in front of the children. Not once. Marco continued his work. Chiara tended her garden. The twins chased their mysteries, and yet, something had changed. Not enough for anyone to point to. Not enough for anyone to name. But sometimes change arrives like a distant storm. Long before the rain comes, the air feels different. The family felt it, though none of them would have said so. One evening, after helping his father repair a section of fence near the upper meadow, Evan climbed the familiar slope above the house. It was his favorite place, a stretch of grass overlooking the valley below. From there he could see the village, the forests, the winding river that glittered in the sunlight, and, once darkness arrived, the endless sky above. He dropped onto the grass and folded his hands behind his head. The earth was still warm from the afternoon sun. Crickets sang in the fading light. Far below, tiny points of fire began appearing in the village as families lit lamps for the evening, one by one, like stars arriving before the stars themselves. Evan smiled. Then he looked up and waited. The first star appeared. A tiny point of silver against the deepening blue. Then another, then 3 more. Soon the sky was filling with them. Not all at once. Never all at once. That was one of the things Evan loved most. The stars arrived the way guests arrived at a gathering. One here, one there, each announcing itself quietly, until suddenly the sky was crowded with them. Most people looked at the stars and saw lights. Evan saw questions. He always had. Questions. Nobody around him seemed interested in asking. What were they? Why did they move? Why did some return to the same places while others wandered? Why did certain patterns appear at certain times of year? His father knew some of the old stories. Stories about hunters, heroes, creatures that lived among the stars. Marco had taught him many of them, and Evan loved those stories. But lately he had begun wondering if there was something else hidden behind them. Something waiting to be understood. A few months earlier he had started keeping records. Nothing formal, just scratches on a flat piece of slate. Marks showing where certain stars appeared. Notes about when they rose. Notes about when they vanished. At first it had seemed pointless. Then patterns began appearing, and once a person discovers a pattern, it becomes almost impossible to stop looking for the next one. So he continued, night after night, mark after mark, the slate slowly filling with observations. If anyone had asked what he hoped to discover, Evan would not have known what to say. He wasn't searching for treasure. He wasn't trying to solve a mystery. He simply felt drawn to it, the way some people feel drawn to rivers or forests or music. Something about the stars made him want to keep looking, as though they were trying to tell a story. And he had only learned a few words of the language. Above him, the sky deepened into darkness. The great river of the Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, thousands upon thousands of distant lights. More than he could count. More than he could imagine. Evan stared upward and felt very small. Surprisingly, he liked that feeling. Most people dislike feeling small. But Evan found comfort in it. The world was enormous. The stars were older than kingdoms, older than cities, older than any story he had ever heard. Whatever troubles waited for him tomorrow, they would still be tiny compared to all of that. There was peace in knowing it. A cool breeze swept across the meadow. The grass rustled softly around him. For a moment he closed his eyes, then opened them again. And there it was, the feeling, the strange feeling that always came when he watched the night sky long enough. Not fear, not excitement, recognition, as though he had forgotten something important, and the stars were patiently waiting for him to remember. He frowned slightly. The feeling vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the night, the stars, and the sound of crickets singing in the dark. Evan laughed quietly at himself. Perhaps he had spent too much time alone. Perhaps that was all. Yet even as he thought it, he wasn't entirely convinced. Far above him, countless stars shone silently, cold, ancient, watching. Or perhaps that was only his imagination. He could never quite decide. And strangely, he never minded not knowing. Some mysteries become smaller when you solve them. The stars felt like the opposite. The more he learned, the larger they became. Hours passed, the grass cooled. Dew began gathering on the meadow. His boots grew damp. At last he sat up and stretched. The lights in the house below still glowed warmly through the darkness. Home. A simple word. A powerful thing. For a moment he looked back at the sky one final time. The stars glittered overhead, silent as ever, patient as ever, waiting. Though for what? He could not have said. Evan stood, brushed the grass from his clothes, and began walking back down toward the house. He did not know that the letter resting inside the wooden chest would one day carry him farther than he had ever imagined. He did not know that the questions he asked the stars would eventually be answered, or that those answers would lead to even greater questions. Tonight he was simply a boy walking home beneath the night sky, a boy who loved the stars, a boy who believed he was studying them, not yet realizing that, in some strange way, they had already begun studying him. If Evan loved looking upward, Tasha preferred looking between things. Not at things, between them, which may sound strange. But then, Tasha often noticed things other people missed. On the evening of the last truly warm day of summer, she sat upon the low stone wall beside the herb garden. The wall was one of her favorite places. From there she could see almost everything. The house, the path to the village, the forest above, the valley below, and most importantly, she could sit quietly without anyone asking her to explain what she was doing. Tasha liked that, not because she was secretive. She simply preferred observing before speaking. Words, she felt, often arrived too early. A small beetle crawled across the stone beside her. Most children would have lost interest after a few moments. Tasha watched it for nearly 10 minutes. The beetle climbed over a crack in the rock, disappeared briefly, reappeared, changed direction, stopped, changed direction again. Apparently, it had very important beetle business to attend to. Tasha approved. She understood the importance of paying attention. The sun was setting behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the hillside. The forest above the house had begun to darken. Birdsong faded. Even the wind seemed quieter. The world was settling into evening, and that was when Tasha noticed it. Something moved near the tree line. Not an animal, not a person. Something else. Something she had seen before. Only a handful of times. Always at a distance. Always near the edges of things. Tasha sat perfectly still, watching. The movement was difficult to describe. Imagine seeing a fish beneath the surface of a pond. You cannot always see the fish itself. Sometimes you only notice the ripples, or the shifting reflection, or the way the water behaves differently for a moment. This felt similar. The shape seemed almost hidden inside the world, as though it belonged partly here and partly somewhere else. It moved slowly along the edge of the forest, not creeping, not stalking, simply traveling, purposefully, patiently. Like someone following a path only they could see. Tasha watched carefully. The thing never looked toward the house, never approached, never threatened. If anything, it seemed curious, the way a traveler might glance toward a distant village while continuing their journey. Most children would have run to tell someone. Tasha did not because she was afraid nobody would believe her, and not because she thought she had imagined it. The truth was much simpler. She wasn't sure what she had seen, and Tasha disliked explaining things she did not yet understand. Over the years she had noticed other strange things, a shadow where no shadow should be, a figure glimpsed at the edge of a forest path, a feeling that someone had entered a room moments before a door opened. Little things, quiet things, things easy to dismiss. Except they kept happening, again and again and again. When she had been younger, she told Elaine everything, every sighting, every mystery, every strange feeling. Elaine had listened carefully, then asked 17 questions, which, in fairness, was exactly what Elaine did with everything. After a while, the sisters developed an understanding. Tasha would notice, Elaine would investigate. Neither was entirely sure which role was more difficult. Now Tasha sat alone upon the wall, watching the distant movement. The fading light turned the forest's dark blue. The mountains became silhouettes against the sky. Slowly, the strange presence drifted toward the upper meadow, the same meadow where Evan often watched the stars. For a brief moment it paused, or perhaps that was only how it seemed. Then it continued into the trees and vanished. Tasha waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. Nothing returned. The forest became still once more. Whatever she had seen was gone. She looked toward the house. Warm light glowed through the window. Inside, she could see her father sitting at the table. His head bent over something, perhaps work, perhaps the letter. She could not tell. For a moment she watched him. Then she looked back toward the forest. The tree line stood silent, ordinary, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Tasha smiled slightly. The world did that sometimes. It showed you something impossible, then immediately pretended it had never happened. At last, she climbed down from the wall, brushed the dust from her hands, and headed inside for supper. She told no one what she had seen. Not her mother, not her father, not even Evan. The sight joined dozens of others she had quietly collected over the years, carefully stored away in the private library of her thoughts, waiting for understanding, waiting for a pattern, waiting for the day when all the strange little pieces finally fit together. Far above the mountain, hidden beyond sight and beyond knowing, ancient things moved through the unseen places of the world. Tasha could not have explained this, could not have named it, could not have understood it. She only knew one simple truth. Sometimes, when everyone else looked at the world, she felt as though the world was looking back, and on that evening, sitting upon the garden wall as summer slipped quietly toward autumn, she had the unmistakable feeling that something had just passed nearby. Something old, something watchful, something that would matter later, though not yet, not tonight. Tonight she was simply a 7-year-old girl walking home through the twilight, carrying a mystery she did not yet know was a mystery. If Tasha noticed mysteries, Elaine collected explanations. At least, that was the plan. The world, unfortunately, did not always cooperate. On the morning after Tasha's evening by the garden wall, Elaine sat cross-legged beneath the large chestnut tree beside the house. Spread around her was a remarkable collection of objects. 3 feathers, 7 pebbles, a broken button, length of twine, 2 chestnuts, pine cone, a piece of charcoal, and a notebook, made from several sheets of rough paper stitched together by hand. To most people, it looked like a pile of nonsense. To Elaine, it was research. The trouble with being curious, you see, is that eventually you become curious about everything, and once that happens, there are never enough hours in the day. Elaine had accepted this unfortunate reality years ago. Even at 7 years old, she carefully picked up one of the feathers, examined it, compared it to a mark in her notebook, made another note, then nodded with great satisfaction as though an important scientific breakthrough had just occurred, which, in her opinion, it had. The family dog wandered over. He sniffed the collection, sneezed, then sat directly on the notebook. Elaine sighed, not angrily, just with the weary patience of someone accustomed to working with difficult colleagues. You're not helping, the dog remained, unconvinced. After a brief negotiation, involving ear scratches and a piece of dried meat, the notebook was recovered. Elaine returned to her work. Her latest project concerned birds. More specifically, why certain birds always appeared in the valley several days before a change in weather. Most adults simply said the birds knew. Elaine found this answer deeply unsatisfying. How did they know? What exactly were they noticing? Could the pattern be measured? Could it be predicted? Could she predict it before the birds did? Now that would be interesting. So she had begun recording everything. Bird sightings, cloud shapes, wind direction, temperature, rainfall, the position of the sun, the behavior of insects, the timing of dawn, the timing of dusk. Anything that might matter, and possibly several things that did not. Most of her notes made sense only to her. Small symbols, strange, abbreviations, columns of observations, tiny diagrams. The notebook looked less like the work of a child and more like the field journal of a very determined explorer. From the doorway, Chiara watched for a moment. Parents often enjoy seeing their children reveal who they are becoming, and Elaine revealed herself constantly, not through speeches, not through grand declarations, through habits. The little things, the questions she asked, the things she chose to pay attention to. Elaine, the girl looked up immediately. Yes? What are you studying today? Elaine considered this, then pointed toward the valley. The weather, Chiara glanced at the perfectly clear sky. There isn't any weather. There will be. The certainty in her voice made Chiara smile. And how do you know? Elaine held up her notebook. The swallows arrived 3 days early. Perhaps they simply felt like arriving early. Elaine looked horrified by the suggestion. Birds did not simply feel like things, at least not in any way she considered useful. There is always a reason, Chiara smiled. Again, there usually is. Then she returned to her work, leaving Elaine beneath the chestnut tree and leaving the weather to sort itself out. The truth was that Elaine saw the world differently. Where other people saw events, she saw connections. Where others saw accidents, she looked for causes. And where others accepted coincidence, she grew suspicious. Not because she disliked mystery, quite the opposite. She loved mystery. But to Elaine, a mystery was simply a pattern that had not yet revealed itself. A sudden breeze stirred the branches overhead. Leaves rustled, the feathers scattered. Several pages of notes threatened to escape. Elaine lunged after them with the speed of someone protecting priceless treasure, which, again, was exactly how she viewed them. As she gathered the papers, something caught her eye, a sequence of marks near the edge of one page. She frowned, looked at another page, then another, comparing, checking, counting. Slowly, a smile appeared, not a large smile. The sort of smile mathematicians wear when numbers finally behave themselves. The swallows, the wind, the insects, the timing of dawn, all of them pointed toward the same conclusion: rain within. 2 days, possibly sooner. Elaine sat back with enormous satisfaction. The prediction might be wrong, but that hardly mattered. The important thing was that the pieces fit, the pattern existed, and she had found it. At supper that evening, she announced her conclusion to the family. It will rain tomorrow. Marco glanced out the window. The sky remained perfectly clear. It might. It will. How do you know? Elaine immediately launched into an explanation involving birds, insects, wind currents, cloud formations, and several observations nobody else remembered making. By the end, everyone at the table looked slightly overwhelmed. Everyone except Tasha, who nodded as though the explanation made perfect sense. The next afternoon, rain arrived, not a storm, just a gentle mountain rain, the kind that darkens stone walls and leaves diamonds of water on every leaf. Elaine tried very hard not to look pleased with herself. She failed completely. That evening, as droplets fell softly from the eaves of the house, Marco ruffled her hair. You were right. Elaine nodded. I know, which made everyone laugh, even Elaine. Later, after the family had gone to bed, the little notebook remained beside her sleeping pallet, filled with observations, filled with questions, filled with patterns, most of them small, most of them ordinary. Yet someday those same habits would lead her toward questions far larger than weather and birds. Questions hidden beneath the surface of the world, itself questions nobody had successfully answered. Not yet, but that belonged to another day. For now, she was simply a little girl beneath a chestnut tree, collecting clues, chasing patterns, trying to understand how the world fit together. And though she did not know it, the world was quietly preparing a puzzle far greater than any she had ever imagined. The rain did not last long. By sunset, the clouds had drifted eastward, leaving the mountains washed clean and shining beneath the fading light. Tiny drops still clung to the leaves. The stone walls glistened. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. It was the sort of evening people remember years later without quite knowing why. Supper was simple: fresh bread, goat cheese, vegetables from the garden, a pot of stew that Chiara insisted could cure almost anything. Marco claimed it could also remove paint from wood. Chiara informed him that if he continued making comments like that, she would happily test the theory. The children laughed. Marco wisely changed the subject. The family ate together while the last sunlight faded beyond the mountains. The twins argued cheerfully about whether birds understood weather or merely reacted to it. Elaine presented evidence. Tasha presented doubts. Neither succeeded in convincing the other. Both enjoyed the argument immensely. Evan listened more than he spoke. His thoughts kept drifting toward the stars waiting beyond the roof, toward questions he could not quite explain, toward places he had never seen, though if someone had asked him why, he would not have known the answer. At the head of the table, Marco and Chiara exchanged occasional glances. Small glances, quick glances, the sort parents believe children never notice, the sort children always notice. The letter was not mentioned, not directly, yet somehow it sat among them all the same, invisible, patient, waiting. After supper, the family moved outside. The evening was too beautiful to waste indoors. The western sky blazed with gold and crimson. Far below, the valley glowed beneath the last light of day. The world seemed peaceful, complete, as though nothing difficult had ever happened, as though nothing difficult ever would. Marco settled onto the stone wall overlooking the valley. Chiara sat beside him. The twins chased fireflies through the garden, each convinced they had developed a superior capture strategy. Neither strategy worked. The fireflies remained unimpressed. Evan wandered a short distance uphill, not far, just enough to see the first stars beginning to appear. One by one, patiently, as they always did. For a while, nobody spoke, and that silence was one of the things the family loved most. Not an uncomfortable silence, not an empty silence, the silence that comes when people know each other so well that words become optional. The sun disappeared completely. Twilight settled over the mountains. The first cool breeze of evening swept across the hillside. Somewhere in the valley below, a church bell rang. The sound drifted upward through the darkness. Soft, distant, beautiful. Chiara leaned gently against Marco's shoulder. "You're thinking about it." Marco smiled. "A little? Only a little?" "A great deal." She laughed quietly. "I thought so." For a moment neither spoke. Then Chiara asked the question they had both been carrying for days. "If we go," Marco nodded. "If we go, what happens then?" The valley stretched before them, darkening now beneath the approaching night. The home they had built, the life they understood, the future they expected, all of it lay there, familiar, certain, comforting. Marco took a long breath. "I don't know." It was not an answer he enjoyed giving, yet sometimes it was the only honest one. Chiara looked toward the children, toward Evan, toward Tasha, toward Elaine. 3 lives, 3 futures, 3 paths not yet chosen. "Neither do I," she admitted. The stars continued appearing overhead, one after another, as though the sky itself were slowly waking. At last Marco smiled. "We don't have to decide tonight." Chiara nodded. "No." But they both knew the decision was coming. Across the garden, Tasha paused suddenly. For just a moment. The feeling returned, the same feeling she had experienced near the forest. The sense that something unseen had moved nearby, watching, waiting, then it vanished. Gone before she could grasp it. She glanced toward the trees. Nothing stood there, only darkness, only shadows, only the forest. Meanwhile, Elaine sat beside the stone wall with her notebook, recording observations about fireflies. Because naturally she was. Someone needed to understand why they blinked when they did. And she had appointed herself for the task. Evan looked up at the stars. The familiar feeling returned. the feeling that the sky was somehow larger than it appeared, the feeling that questions waited beyond the darkness. Patiently, quietly, until someone was ready to ask them. The night deepened. One by one, the children grew tired. The fireflies disappeared. The valley lights dimmed. The mountain settled into silence. Soon the family returned inside. The door closed, the lamps were extinguished. The house grew dark, warm, safe, still. And for a little while longer, everything remained exactly as it had always been. A father, a mother, 3 children, a stone house beneath the stars, a family together. Many years later, each of them would remember that evening. Not because anything remarkable happened. Nothing did. That was the point. Years later, they would remember the smell of the rain, the warmth of the fire, the sound of laughter drifting through the garden, the sight of stars above the mountain, the feeling of being home. Because when great adventures begin, they rarely announce themselves with trumpets. They do not arrive with thunder. They do not come crashing through the door. Most often, they begin quietly, with a letter resting in a wooden chest, with a question waiting to be answered, with a family gathered together on an ordinary evening, never suspecting that the world is about to become much larger, far beyond the mountains, far beyond the stars, beyond every road, every kingdom, every sea. Fate and chaos continued their watch. The ancient presences observed the little house glowing in the darkness, so small, so fragile, so important. Chaos spoke first. They still don't know. No. They believe they have time. Fate was silent for a moment, then answered, "Everyone believes they have time." The little house remained visible below, a tiny point of warmth against the vastness of creation. Chaos watched thoughtfully. Will they go? Fate looked toward the countless threads of possibility stretching across the ages. Some bright, some broken, some beautiful, some terrible, all unfinished. Then fate answered, "The door has opened." Chaos smiled. "That wasn't my question." No, it wasn't. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, at last, fate's voice drifted across the endless ether. Soft as a whisper, certain as sunrise. "The story has begun." End of chapter 1.